To another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we have a special guest, Danny Sheply here, and we're going to be breaking down the Kentucky Ole Miss game Saturday, 12 noon kickoff. Now, with this game here, I'm definitely fascinated about it for a couple of reasons, although Ole Miss is definitely clearly the favorite in the game for a number of reasons. Jaxson Dart has been looking phenomenal so far in his first four appearances, 12 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 5,500 yards, 80% completion percentage, and for the most part, the defense has looked pretty solid. They've stopped the teams that they have. They have wins against Furman, Middle Tennessee, Wake Forest, and all those guys. They're 15 and a half point favorites in this game versus Kentucky. And when I think about this game, and they've put out 220 points compared to the 29 they gave up so far. So statistically speaking, they've definitely been one of the best teams in the country. Certainly a top 10 team. And when you think about this game holistically, at least on the surface, it seems to me that this game is going to be much more telling for Kentucky compared to Ole Miss. I mean, I'll have Danny elaborate in a second in terms of what we'll see with Ole Miss, but I think from Kentucky's perspective, I think the biggest thing we're going to see is, obviously their defensive line is one of the best in the country. They rank sixth in stopping the run, and Lane Kiffin even acknowledged this in his press conference of the game this week that he compared Kentucky's defensive line to that of an NFL caliber defense as well. And especially I talked a couple weeks ago on the show about how great Kentucky's defense was, particularly stopping Trevor Etienne against Georgia, and also even Mark Stoops himself giving him a ton of credit in recognizing that they've spent a lot of time, money, and resources really trying to revamp that Kentucky team. And Danny, with that said, I kind of laid the foundation in terms of what we expect with this matchup between Kentucky and Ole Miss. So with that said, I mean you've watched Ole Miss pretty extensively. You saw the first four games of the year. What do you expect Ole Miss to try and do versus Kentucky this week?
First and foremost, I'm expecting Ole Miss to try to dominate the line of scrimmage, which is not a usual trend that they have. But against Kentucky's defensive line and front seven, I think will be important early. Try to establish that and get a strong running game going early.
And I mentioned this about Jaxson Dart too, and he's been great so far. 80% completion percentage. 1,500 yards now. I think one of the things that I find interesting about Ole Miss is for the most part we haven't heard much about Ole Miss's rushing attack. Particularly, we know Jenkins transferred to Ohio State, and even when we previewed Ole Miss as a team a couple months ago, we did mention the running game a little bit. So how do you anticipate Ole Miss rushing the ball, or do you kind of expect them to say, what, we're just going to try and test Kentucky's secondary and throw it in the air?
I do expect them to try to run the ball. We going into the season, I was expecting Ulysses Bentley to be the primarily ball carrier, and as it turns out, I think he's had some off the field issues he's trying to work out. So it's turned to Henry Parrish, who's played, in my opinion, pretty amazing, and now the whole one cut guy, north and south runner. So I think it should be fun to watch him run behind that O line. I do expect him to run it more. I think the passing is a little skewed from the opponents we were playing. I think if Kentucky plays as competitively, especially in the first half, we'll see a lot more running.
Yeah, because I think regardless of, obviously they're a 15-point favorite, and, if you look at what some other analysts are saying, obviously they're picking the game more in terms of the spread. Because at least to me, every time I watch a Kentucky game, it's either a nail biter at the very end, or it's just an ass whooping. Like they got whooped by South Carolina, but then they showed up and played Georgia pretty tough. And for at least for this week, it is Ole Miss's first SEC game and everything. But back to Kentucky for a second too. When you think about this offense, I think the one thing you got to see is obviously Brock Vandagriff. He transferred from Georgia to Kentucky, and although he he really is a solid run. He is a solid runner, and I do think he deserves some credit for that. But there has to be a point where that offense evolves a little bit more, and try to make some bigger plays. Because I mean, yes, we did see them put up 42 against the MAC conference game against Ohio last week, which they looked good. He got out of the pocket. He was able to make some big time throws, and you're definitely gonna need more of that magic going into Ole Miss this week. So with that said, kind of my last question for you in terms of Ole Miss in general is, you've probably watched a little bit of the Kentucky Georgia game. One of the biggest issues that Vandergriff has had is, yes, he's a good runner and he can get outside the pocket and everything, but he's had some fumbling issues. So with that said, how do you expect Ole Miss's defense to come out? Do you expect some more pressures or disguises, or how best do you think that they need to attack Kentucky in order to really seal the victory?
Yeah, as far as Brock Vandergriff goes in early in the game, I'm curious to see if they do bring extra pressure. I do not think I think our front four would be able to apply pressure without having to blitz, especially in the beginning of the game. I also could see they have been doing a lot of nickel blitzes and safety blitzes, so I can see them mixing that in there in the beginning to try to get in his head a little bit. But Brock also, I think he also just needs more time to get new system, new coaching staff, new everything. Their schedule didn't really do him any favors in terms of being able to get into a rhythm and get a couple games under his belt. But I do think he will be improved going into this week.
Yeah, and we even talked about this. This is a good point you brought up with the secondary, particularly some of the nickel coverage as you see. Definitely going to anticipate some disguised blitzes, and I think to some extent they are going to just straight up pressure Brock, and to the extent like, okay, if, we know you can run a little bit. We're going to expect some read options, some RPOs, and all that. But when push comes to shove, if it is one of those 23-13 games going to the fourth quarter and Vandegrift has to throw on them, I definitely see some serious question marks with that, especially with Ole Miss's secondary definitely doesn't get enough credit for what they've done in general. And also, we talked about this at the very beginning of the season too. Pete Golding's coming in, one hell of a defensive coordinator, and certainly one of the best in the country. So it definitely brings everything full perspective. But in terms of this game, I definitely agree with a lot of your points. You have a Kentucky team who rebounded very strongly against that Georgia loss, and you have Ole Miss who consistently rolling. You have Jaxson Dart who's definitely going to be a Heisman Trophy candidate. You have rushing attack who's ready to have a big day. Although Kentucky's defensive line is definitely one of the best in the country. So definitely fascinated to see what will happen. But we appreciate your time, and we'll see what happens on Saturday.
Yeah, I am looking forward to the game. I do think I think the spread's around 15.5. I wouldn't be too confident in pushing that. I would think it would be closer to a 7 to 12 point game myself. I am looking forward to it though.
Awesome.
Thank you
Appreciate
for
your
having
time.
me on.
Yeah.